Okay, so we missed a little bit, but anyway, we're talking about displays here. And so displays are triggered by a lot of different things. Like lots of birds are potential mates. You know, I mean, instead of, they not only sing, but they also do get quite involved in the dancing part of it, as you can see here. This is a spotted sandpiper right here. This is a buff-breasted sandpiper and a piping plover, kind of a dark image of that it looks like, but all of these birds are signaling to other birds. And it's all, these are all taken basically during, especially the spotted sandpiper and the buff-breasted, those are taken during the breeding period. And the piping plover, I think that's a winter shot, but it's still displayed. But they also do a lot of displays triggered by predators and threats, especially if there's a threat to their young. And they'll also do if there's competitors to either breeding and feeding territories. So these displays, they're kind of difficult to interpret sometimes, but you know, they may display gender and age or signal their fitness or that they're ready to mate, and or you know, what their maturity is, what their pecking order is, as it were. They also defend these nesting, and they also defend feeding territories, and that's both intra and inter specifically. So you'll see on that photo on the left, black-necked stilt and an American avocet, and they were basically doing this kind of elaborate semi-aggressive dance to one another because they were crossing into each other's territory, it seemed. And then you've got, and that's during breeding season. And then you've got these two surf birds, which we got to see last weekend, sort of through a scope. And this is a winter photograph, and they're basically displaying to one another during probably over a feeding territory dispute. You will see them oftentimes. It's like, wait a minute, this is where I'm eating. You go someplace else. May be the message. And since shorebirds are ground nesting birds, they defend these territories, and especially if you get close to their nest, they really defend them vigorously. Here's an American avocet that was flying and squawking at me and got pretty close to let me know, hey, I've got a nest over here, and you seem like a trouble to me, so you get out of there. And indeed, of course, I did back off because it seemed quite upset. They also have, a lot of them have these distraction displays, especially plovers. Killdeers, a lot of us have seen this broken wing ruse. It's one of the more elaborates. I mean, it really does look like this bird is like kind of smashed into the ground there, and its wings are broken, and it'll call and get your attention if you get close to its nest, which is the case. I looked down, it's like, oh, a lot of times you're on these killdeer nests before you even know it. And but I took the moment to take a quick snap before I backed away. They're generally really noisy. And we heard some of this. Can you all hear that? You cannot. Okay,
barely.
bummer. Let me see something.
There, that's more like it.
I'll get this Zoom figured out just when we go back to meeting in person. So we got to hear that at this last field trip, although over cutting through some white noise of the ocean. And oyster catchers, they're super loud, and they have to be super loud because they're in this really noisy environment. They also are very performative. Oyster catchers are. They engage in these exaggerated butterfly flights, especially if a competitor gets in the scene where you'll have a bonded couple and some other one comes in. Then there's quite a lot of engagement then. And they'll also do this flatten out and raise their tails while calling loudly. It's pretty cool. Least sandpipers too, I mean, basically all of them make calls, but the least sandpipers, which is the least of all the sandpipers, engage in two really distinct call types. This 1 second trill. Kind of nice, huh? And then the short frequency modulated call, they call it. It almost sounds like one of those thrushes, you know, the Catharis thrushes that do that kind of dual tone singing there at the end. But they're not songbirds, of course. They still have a pretty well-developed syrinx to be able to do that. A lot of people, if you go up into the Sierra or other places, wet meadows in the summertime, you'll hear this call.
Florian, disconnected. Ready to connect.
Isn't that wonderful? That sound is made by their tail feathers, which is pretty amazing, I think. I always think about when I'm up there and I'm hearing that, you know, up at like the Sierra Valley and on these quiet, dusky evenings, and you'll start hearing them. And sometimes they're really high, sometimes lower. And I'll start thinking, how did that evolve, right? So, I mean, did one of them just like accidentally come upon it and say, oh, cool, wow, look what I can do with my feathers. And then it exaggerated it more and more and more to where all this, now it's got like these specially designed feathers, and it grows actually 2 extra feathers or maybe even 4 extra feathers on some of the species. I mean, it seemed something caused that to evolve, and must have been that, you know, it just thought it was really cool, and so did some female snipe. And so, you know, a match was made in heaven, you know. And anyway, if, you know, in really good places to find that are any of the high, wet Sierra valleys, or also further north too. But we're lucky we get this species breeding here in California, and with these special muscles.
How do they do that with feathers?
I'm sorry?
How do they do that with their feathers?
Well, it has to do with the combination of the right atmospheric conditions and a certain way they fly and a certain way that they hold their feathers out that make that sound. I mean, you would definitely, if you heard it, you'd like, oh yeah, wow, listen to that weird sound it's making with its throat, right?
Oh.
But no, it's not. That is a feather made sound. Kind of similar along the lines of, Anna's hummingbirds.
Right.
You know about them, in the
Yep.
bottom of there, they'll do that pop. And you're
Oh.
like, this little bird is doing that just by flicking its tail feathers out at the perigee of a dive, right? So, but these birds are doing this, in this very controlled way, and I've never seen one do it when it was windy. It's only when it's, these calm, dusky evenings. Shorebirds are mostly epic migrators. I mean, they are of all the birds, other than maybe seabirds. Somebody got a duck. Of all the seabirds, of all the birds, shorebirds they're the ones that have kind of the most amazing migration style. Most of them, nearly 2/3 of North American Arctic breeders, they are migrating all the way from down to Central and South America. We're getting some dog sound there. I'm sorry, I'm going to mute you though, because although that's pretty amusing, I will say. Okay, anyway, I'm back. But some of these guys, some of these birds, they're doing like these super epic long distance flights. Some of them can fly up to 6,000 miles without refueling. And some of them fly 15,000 miles annually. So they're flying basically from the Arctic all the way down in the Americas, from the Arctic all the way down to, South America. You'll see birds down as far as in southern Peru. I imagine even further, that breed in the Arctic. Those birds, kind of like Arctic terns, they never see anything but summer. It's like endless summer. Wasn't just the surfers that discovered that. So they're very fast flyers too. They can reach over 50 miles an hour of sustained flight is not uncommon. I mean, imagine that under your own power, going 50 miles per hour for hours and hours and hours like that. Some species have been known, tagged, and followed over 2,000 miles in less than 2 days. 1,000 miles a day under your own power. It's really just quite a phenomenon. So to do that, a lot of them go through these amazing hormonal changes. And I'm not going to get into that part of the anatomy too deep, because it's that's a 1 hour class in itself. But basically they get into this overeating kind of situation where they just gorge and literally double their body weight, some of them. So that'd be like us eating, me, I'm 135 pounds. I'd be started out at 135, I'd be 270 within like a 4-week period. Double my body weight, 4 to 6 week period, and then fly it all off over, a 2 or 3 week period. It's quite a trick. A lot of them, one kind of interesting migration phenomena is that there's a lot of leapfrog migration too. So of the same species, the ones that breed furthest north fly to the farthest south. So, and you're wondering like, okay, why bother? Why do all that? But a couple things, one thing is they're up, say, for example, in northern Alaska, and there's this 24 hours of daylight. What you gonna do? You're gonna eat and breed and eat some more, and then you're going to take off and fly. Well, all these other areas, they've been kind of picked through, they're already taken. So you just keep on going and end up way far south down in, Peru or Tierra del Fuego. Kind of a cool example is our Pacific golden plover. So they fly continuously for more than 100 hours to travel 5,000 to 7,000 kilometers from way up here all the way to Hawaii or all the way down to New Zealand. Any of these islands, these South Pacific Islands to the coast of Australia, 100 hours of nonstop flight. And you might remember that we were talking about the primary length and being able to identify the difference between black-bellied plovers and American golden plovers and Pacific golden plovers, and how the golden plovers have extra long wings, and that is somehow that evolved basically to aid them in these epic journeys. Another thing I always think of is interesting about that is, so this is the state now, of the levels of the ocean, but at one time, not so long ago during the ice ages, our oceans would have been up to 400 feet lower in depth, only 14,000 years ago. So these birds would have been migrating there, and they would have had a lot more land choices. There would have been a lot more exposed land, more islands for them to stop at, all of that. So in kind of in the bigger scheme of things, they have been having probably fewer choices as the oceans rise. But they've been through many different ice ages where the ice, lowered the buildup of ice, lowered the sea levels. So, I mean, at least 7 in the last 250,000 years. So they're probably used to it. They've evolved to kind of deal with it. But it's kind of interesting to think about, especially as we're dealing with increasing sea level rise now. And one thing about that is these staging areas. These staging areas that they historically rely on, they often rely on very specific food to refuel during or on each end of their trip. And because of that relying on these staging areas, if these staging areas become somehow ecologically challenged in many different ways, they can, then because of climate change or human activities or whatever, then it can be, make the birds vulnerable. And so, for example, a really good example and a well-known example of that is typified in the Delaware Bay, where for millions of years, or for a very long time, 1.5 million shorebirds all arrive within 3 to 4 weeks in the Delaware Bay, and synchronize with the annual breeding of the bay's horseshoe crabs. So there was a real alarming, this is a red knot that we're looking at a photo. There was a big alarm, and many of you probably know this story, that the red knots that go through the Delaware Bay, their populations were crashing. And they sort of kind of tried to figure it out, and they're like, oh, they're really been harvesting the heck out of horseshoe crabs there, and these birds eat horseshoe crab eggs. And so they, they were using these horseshoe crabs for all kinds of things, but mostly like not food for humans, but more like fertilizer and pet food and things like that, right? So, and there was a conservation effort to kind of limit the take on horseshoe crabs, and things have gotten a little bit better for the red knots. But recently, something else has come into play, and this is kind of a weird sidebar, is that these horseshoe crabs have what they call blue blood. And indeed they do. This is some horseshoe crabs that are being bled into these containers. And that blue blood is used in medicine to ensure that anything that gets injected or implanted into the human body is free of potential bacterial contamination. So it's super valuable for humans after all. And so scientists have been using these like really clever blood cells to develop these tests called limulus amoebocyte lysate, or LAL, which checks these new vaccines. When vaccines are developed and sent out, checks them for contamination. So this technique's been used all over the world since the 1970s to stop medical professionals from giving out jabs full of bad bacteria that could make humans very sick. So it's super valuable. And so, of course, the stock of that has really, risen lately because of the coronavirus and those vaccines that have been going out by the billions. And so on the world market, a quart of this horseshoe crab blood has a price tag of an estimated $15,000. So, and they're currently getting revenues annually of $50 million per year for horseshoe crab blood. Isn't that weird? So anyway, I don't know what that means for the birds in Delaware Bay or other places where there's where they rely on these horseshoe crabs, but hopefully they're figuring out some other ways to get around that issue.
That is
Anyway.
wild.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, I know. It's sort of, that's kind of news to me too. I knew about the horseshoe crab thing, and I'd heard about this LAL thing, so I started researching into it way back. I was like, man, who would have thought that? Anyway, but they kind of stopped them from harvesting back some years ago, or limited the harvest for silly things like fertilizer and pet food. So one thing that's really helpful, and that is knowing a bit about shorebird migration timing can really help with your expectations when you go to someplace. And sometimes it can help like narrow down an identification, like should that shorebird be here? I mean, is this one really out of range for this time of the season? Or maybe it's something else, you know, and here's an example of a Western sandpiper staging and breeding. So in late summer, they're up in this Yukon River Delta. This area all is their breeding range up here. And then they move down in the fall to this Fraser River Delta and the San Francisco Bay. We start getting Western sandpipers here in late July. And by early August, they're here in good numbers. And then they can, a lot of them continue on down. You can kind of see this blue line here. This is all their wintering. They winter all the way down. You know, it's an abundant species, so they have a very wide wintering range. But imagine the density up here in their breeding range. And then, so that's, they're breeding up here, and they move down into the fall in the Fraser River. They're here by starting in July. Another place that they shelter from, another really important place, is the Cheyenne Bottoms, which is in south central Kansas. I finally got to go there last year. Pretty cool place. And right now it'll be super loaded with shorebirds. You wouldn't think, it's like in the mid, kind of like you're going 100 miles of cornfields, just like, you know, if you've been to Kansas, you've seen before. And then, but you can go to this place and there's these amazing, the Cheyenne Bottoms National Wildlife Refuge in the Quivira. And they're both just fantastic places to go birding if you're ever happen to be passing through Kansas at the right time of year. And so, and then in the spring, when they're making their march north, they stop again this spring at the Copper River Delta to fatten up again, one last chance before they go on back up into their breeding ground. So it's pretty cool. So they really rely heavily on this one area. 90% of the world's population of Western sandpipers stage in spring at this Copper River Delta. So if that place, for whatever reason, you know, got messed up ecologically, that would be really hard on Western sandpipers, obviously. So I'm sorry about this chart. I probably doesn't look that good, but I don't know if you can read that or not. But so the thing about, and here's an eBird chart again, and this is one of the reasons why I keep saying use eBird, because you can really look online, go to the eBird and look at sites and see on these bar charts when the anticipated time and how much of a population is at a place at a given time. And so, for example, if you look at least sandpipers, you'll see that they're all the way here until about May, and then there's none. There's none in May and June. And then starting in July, they start coming back, and then they're pretty solid. Western sandpiper is pretty similar. So they're of course in that absent period. They're up on the breeding grounds. Same with Western. But if you notice the Dunlin, they just kind of start trickling in, and they don't really get here until October and November. And so 2 months after the Western and the leaf. So it's very unlikely we're going to see Dunlin if we see a Dunlin, it might even be like a rare bird at this point. They're probably there, but it'll definitely be an infrequent bird, even though it's an abundant species. And the reason, is because of this prolonged stopover, also in the Copper River Delta, but this one is after they breed here and all these places. After they breed, they go for 2 to 3 months to this fall staging area. And which is in this Copper River Delta, which is this really broad, as we saw in that one map, this broad delta. So the parents typically leave this breeding area. Their breeding area is about 2 weeks before their juveniles. And females usually leave the breeding sites first. They're exhausted from parenting. They've been producing all these eggs, they've been raising kids. And so it's an advantage for them to arrive at this staging area early and get the first pick of the food, kind of get their feeding territory, their temporary feeding territory established. And then the males usually leave next from the breeding, and then the juveniles not until later. So whereas we see least in Western sandpipers juveniles kind of at the same time here in July and August, juveniles will be the last ones to the show down here. But we can start expecting Dunlin to arrive here in big numbers in October. And why are they up there? Well, what's so special about this Cook Inlet and this Copper River Delta? Why is it so food productive? And these waves are not are tidal waves that I'm showing in this map. And these waves of birds that are moving through, they don't leave their breeding grounds because of the lack of food on the northern summer grounds, but because there is more food at the staging area for those that arrive first. And that huge food production is all about tidal flow. The further towards the poles, the greater the tidal pull. So like we get a typical tide from in the 4 to 8 foot range in between our high and low tide in a day. Up there, they're getting 25-foot change in 12 hours. And that's why you'll hear people getting into trouble up there in Alaska. They'll go in to visit and they have no idea that, this water goes way out miles and exposes all of this mud flat. And there's all of this benthic life under there that, it's a huge area, a huge mud flat that is super active. So this rise and fall, this in and out, the heave and hoe of the tidal forces, it's responsible for this fantastic production of aquatic life forms. And these birds are there to take advantage of that. Not just Dunlin, but lots and lots of birds. And one thing interesting about tidal, if you're into evolutionary biology, there's evolutionary scientists hypothesize that there would be no life on Earth, or there may not be life at all had it not been for this pull of the moon and the other planetary objects. It's this push and pull that creates conditions that are conducive to life. And so it's kind of cool to see it manifest like this. So once they get down here in October or so, these Dunlin, eventually they'll move out of there because, it starts getting dark a lot and the production is not as much. So they'll come down and interestingly enough, it's still sort of hypothetical, but it appears that they'll come and they'll be in the bay. But if we start getting significant rains up in the Delta, a lot of them go up into the Sacramento Delta and overwinter there. Kind of a cool little thing. So you can start looking for them more, you know, like December, January, if we get the normal rain. And one thing is this is just a slide about how critical of a role the Bay plays, not just, for us locally, but really on a global scale. This is a globally important area, and kind of hard to imagine in the 1950s, they were talking about filling it in. And there was discussion of that. And of course, those very brave women from Save the Bay that started Save the Bay basically kind of said, wait a minute, this is crazy. This is crazy talk. And started, educating people about how amazingly cool the Bay is. And today UNESCO's given it, considers it this biosphere reserve. The Ramsar Western Hemispheric Shorebird Reserve Network has designated a site of hemispheric importance. Holds 77% of California's remaining perennial estuarine wetlands. It hosts more wintering shorebirds than any other estuary along the Pacific coast, south of Alaska.
Eddie,
Yes.
I was up in the Russian River area this last weekend, and on the lower Russian River, which is very low, as you've probably heard.
Right.
And so there's a lot of shore along the river, and a lot of the what looked like islands were just full of birds, of shorebirds. And
Yeah.
it looks like an opportunity of some sort, that there's a lot more shoreline because of the level of the river. I don't know if that's true or not, but it seemed like I'd never experienced that before, obviously because the river wasn't low and there weren't any islands. So
yeah. Well, I'm sure that is, they'll take advantage of whatever they can, and those islands are safe places and probably hold quite a lot of food, especially if they get wet and dry and wet and dry.
Right.
We were last May, we were at this lake and staying on this lake in Western Kentucky, and they had drained the lake because it had a leak in the dam and they needed to fix it. So they drained the lake, but it still had water really shallow in it. And usually that lake is filled with ducks and stuff, but instead there was all these shorebirds in there, which was really cool for us because we got a bunch of birds we typically have to go to the shallow wetlands for, but they were in this lake. So they'll just, they recognize these places and will definitely take advantage of whatever they see. So it's good to know there's, even in a drought situation, there's, it provides something for somebody.
Yeah, I think this might have been brackish area with,
Right. Oh yeah, well it's tidal, right? You're down by
right. It's
Riverville.
low enough so that it's tidal.
Oh yeah.
I did. I hate to admit this, but I didn't have my binoculars with me, and it was literally a raft of black and white birds. I can't tell you what they were, but it was an enormous number of them, hundreds.
That's good to hear. Yeah, the birding in that area is often quite strong.
Yeah.
But this map is the California Audubon Important Bird Area map, and you can kind of see all of this pinkish areas and these greenish areas. There's a Richardson Bay, of course. And then the South Bay is particularly good for shorebirds. Anybody guess why that is? I'll tell you that. It's because it's so shallow. So, you know, when the tide's coming up in and out, it's not up in the central part of the bay. For the most part, it's not exposing a whole lot of mud flat, especially because of all the fill, you know, the foreign fill that's been put in there and dumped in. So, but the south end part of the bay is very shallow and muddy. So a lot of that area, and also up north, not quite as much, but especially the South Bay, it exposes this mud flat, and which is ideal for shorebirds to feed in. I read one thing that when the bay at one point when the bay was filling, you know, so the bay, this current version of the bay is estimated to be about 8,500 years old only. So 10,000 years ago, the bay wasn't here. And because the water was too low, right? And it was just basically a river, the Sacramento San Joaquin, that cut through, went behind Alcatraz and Angel Island, and basically just cut the steep channel through what is today the Golden Gate. And then as the water came up, it you know, it started filling in. This grasslands habitat is probably what it was. And this is, you know, maybe we don't know, but at least 7 different bays of some stage have been here. Because of each ice age, water goes down and it comes up. You know, I mean, of course, the land arrangement would have been different due to some movement. But we're just talking in the last, since the Quaternary, the last 250,000 years or so. It's had 4 major ice ages and 3 others. So it's really interesting to think about how temporal all of this really is that's around us. And I was reading some speculation by some hydrologists that at one point that, you know, the bay was growing by like an inch a week or something like that down in the South Bay, because it's so shallow. It only took another inch and it would, or, you know, a little bit of more water and it would, the rise was pretty dramatic. Kind of fun to think about anyway. But today it's like, we know it holds the majority of the individuals of the 13 most abundant shorebirds in the US during 1 or more seasons. So it's really, we're super lucky to have it. Another thing I just want to kind of touch on briefly, this could be a whole nother class. It's talking about molting and migration, but molting does figure in here. There's always this time distribution for the events. Some birds leave early, some late, and a lot of that is figured in through their molt. So similar species can have very different molt strategies and migration strategies. That's why it ties in with their migration strategies, because typically most birds will not molt and migrate at the same time, since those both are very physiological demanding activities. So again, like the migration and the overeating and the flying and all that, it's hormonally activated, and but we're not going to really have, I'm not going to get into that too deep because we could go down that rabbit hole for a couple of hours. I did want to show, I think we'll see if this works. Hopefully it'll work. This is not high-speed photos. This is my handheld phone. But it is kind of fun to watch how any bird can, like, it shows kind of this flock maneuvering, and it's just a very short few seconds. So that was from a very busy beach in Santa Barbara. That was somebody with their boombox up on the beach. That music you heard, which is pretty nice music. And but the birds were in what they call zagunra, or a migratory restlessness state. You know, and that they're just kind of like they've already fattened up, and they're this is late winter, early spring, and these birds are probably planning on taking out of here after a while. And anyway, but the maneuvering part is what I was just going to try and show you. This the high-speed photos of this shows that any bird can initiate a flock maneuver, and once it's started, it spreads very much like a wave, very much like flocks of fish. So that they have this like super fast reaction time, and the propagation is not, they're not looking out beyond, you know, way out on the edge of the flock or anything. The propagation time is from neighbor to neighbor. So you don't have, you're not like looking at some distant thing. You're just kind of most of your surveillance, if you're a bird, most of your situational awareness is really the birds that are immediately around you, and that you get that information much quicker. So the propagation time is about 15 milliseconds, more than 3 times as fast if they were trying to follow the action of an adjacent flock member. So, you know, when you can, if you could slow this way down, you know, then you would be able to see that there's no way that they're like paying attention over here. They're reacting quicker than that.
So Eddie, is there no leadership then? I mean, it seems that sometimes you'll see a whole shifting in different directions. And how does that mechanism take place? I heard Tom Harpin once say that it was when the majority of the birds flew in a certain direction, they all would then go veer off into that direction. I don't know. Yeah,
well, it is there's I'm going to get into that a little bit more. But and how they're paying attention to certain members of the group, and it may not necessarily be their, you know, that some of the birds are paying attention, all the birds are paying attention to somebody else, but it's a lot faster for you to pay attention to your closest neighbor. If you got to like try and figure out somebody way over there, what they're doing, but there is, so it becomes this wave affair, but they'll generally, since they're paying attention to one another, it's kind of like groupthink, right? So, you know, you don't have to think about everybody in the whole network at the same time if you're getting your most important information from the bird that's right close to you. but I'm sure they're also scanning the bigger picture, of course. And we're gonna I'm gonna talk about some other hypotheses about how the hierarchy of how they do that in a upcoming slide. There, honestly, the cool thing about this is not everything's known. You're right. A lot of these are, you know, this high-speed photography has helped a lot, but it is very, I think they are coming down to the idea that it's very much similar to fish, though the way fish also do the same thing. They react. And you know, being in a group like that, there's always somewhat of a compromise. And for one, you're a lot more conspicuous, right? If you're a big group of birds, of course, shorebirds are kind of conspicuous anyway, because they're not like exactly hiding in trees, you know. But all in all, these advantages outweigh the disadvantages. And there's been some studies on predator scan time. And they estimate that birds that are, when they're alone, they spend 20% of their time scanning for predators. When they're in a flock of 5 birds, they're spending 5% of their time scanning for predators. And when a flock of 25 or more birds, they're scanning 3% of the time. So that's a big difference if you need to eat a lot, right? Which they do. So so there's been some studies along those lines. Also, there's, you know, as you would probably guess, there's this confusion effect. Oh, by the way, that flock right there is Wilson's phalaropes down on Mono Lake, which you know, if you've ever get down to Mono Lake at the right time of year, there can be thousands and tens of thousands of phalaropes there. Very cool, because they stage up there. You know, they're high mountain, valley, you know, high valley, wet meadow breeders. And
What's the right time of year, Eddie?
I believe it's September. Yeah, I would guess August and September. But you know, if you went and looked at Mono Lake and you looked at their eBird bar charts, it would tell you when the best time of year is to go. I'm kind of going from a memory right now that's a little foggy, honestly. So there's also this predator confusion effect. This is a flock of dowitchers. You notice that white elliptical patch on their back? That's a really nice field mark to know that it's dowitchers. The other calidrius sandpipers don't have that. So, but you know, it's kind of isolating one individual is very difficult in that situation if you're a predator. And you know, you can kind of think about this as, okay, throw one tennis ball up in the air and catch it, right? Easy, easy. Now throw 25 up in the air. You're lucky to catch one, because all of a sudden your cat sensors are gonna like, you know, make it hard for you to focus on one, unless you train yourself. And I'm sure the peregrines and the harriers train themselves. But it does add to this, you know, this predator confusion effect. And it also increases to some degree that they're going to have some collision concern diving into this dense flock like this. Another really interesting thing, and something we hopefully will see today, is that you get this niche partitioning of shorebirds. They're often along this gradient associated with their leg and bill length. Of course, naturally, their leg length, how deep of water they can stand in, and that can correlate with their bill length. How deep of water do they feed in? More the leg length than anything at rest, of course. But you'll see these birds dividing this territory up. This photo is actually from this place we're going to go this Sunday. It's two photos, so it's not quite like that, but they just naturally sort themselves out by morphology a lot. So you'll see whimbrels all together. Sometimes they're with curlews, they're pretty similar in size. One bedfellows, if you will, that you'll see a lot is godwits and willets. Very similar leg length and bill length and feeding styles. Whereas we saw with those rocky shorebirds, we saw black turnstones and surfbirds together, and they were feeding in that same area. It's basically they share this close ecological relationship. There's a vertical division. So some of these birds will be picking up tidbits off of the ground. Others are probing. Some prey on creatures living deeper in the water, some on the surface. Some are, on the floating. And then there's also this horizontal division of which ones, some that are searching above the tide line, like plovers, some following the water line, like sanderlings, others in the shallows, and some and they can wade in deeper water, like the stilts, the yellow legs, that sort of thing. Shorebirds are euryphagous, meaning they have a large variety of food that they'll eat. Most of them are feeding on small invertebrates like worms, insects, crustaceans, mollusks. A lot of them will wash their food, get that sand and mud out of there. Not quite raccoon-like, but who wants to eat a whole bunch of sand and mud? So you'll see them. Here we got, we can see there's a photo, not a great photo, but it's a photo of a tattler here with a young cabezon, which is a greenish fish. And other birds that eat fish are, of course, yellow legs, phalaropes, and a curlew with the little small fish there. Curlews also take amphibians, eat bigger critters. So when they're, especially a lot of them, they breed in the prairie. So up in the prairie potholes, so they'll be taking like large insects. I wouldn't be surprised if they'd eat mice, but definitely frogs. I love them frogs. And then their diet, a lot of shorebirds, their diet changes to non-aquatic, especially like upland birds like the curlew, the whimbrel, plovers, upland sandpipers. There's even birds like knots that arrive really early in the Arctic, and they'll consume grass seeds and saxifrage bulbs and old snowberries. I mean, you get fruit-eating shorebirds. It's like, when you need calories, why not? Get a lot of different feeding styles. Here's this bottom photo is of a snowy plover and basically a brine fly, just basically opening its mouth and just running at brine flies and, scooping them up, hoovering them right in there. Whereas this bird, this western sandpiper up there is stalking a single brine fly, which is in red there. Kind of hard to see in a small picture, but if you got a big screen, you might see that. They can kind of broadly be divided into pickers or probers. Pickers will search for food by sight and forage and this typical run and peck manner that you see a lot. Sanderlings are a classic example of that. They'll run a long distance up to a few meters and abruptly stop with their heads high sometimes. Most shorebirds have good night vision, and some of them, especially the plovers, will feed at all night long, which you don't really think about too much, but those plovers got big eyes. Probers usually have these long bills, and they stick these into the soft mud or sand and feel for prey or underneath rocks. Some of them mine the surface in a stitching or sewing machine manner. You'll see this is 2 western sandpipers in the bottom with a least sandpiper at the top right. And you'll see that a lot. Their bills are not rigid, insensitive probes. They've got this, they're very, underneath that horny layer, the bill is rich with these tactile organs where they can feel things. And the bill tip is very mobile. You can kind of see in this photo that the bill is sort of somewhat elasticized. You see how it's kind of like got a little gap in it that you don't normally see. That's from it's just probing down there. So it's not really this super hard surface. It's got some elasticity to it. One clear advantage of mixed flock feeding strategies is demonstrated by the relationship of plovers and sandpipers, particularly black-bellied plovers. The plovers have these large eyes evolved towards the top of their heads, and they act as sentinels. You'll often see them with this attitude of looking up. They're ever alert for the danger. It usually comes from above, right? So, and then they'll let out this high, clear whistle at the first sign of danger. And tattling on the intruder. I think I was talking about tattlers over the weekend, and how, you know, the hunters called them tattlers because they were telling on them when they were sneaking up to market hunt the shorebirds. So all the Tring group of sandpipers, which we'll talk about next week, like yellow legs, those are all tattlers. And the sandpipers, they benefit from this service, but what do they offer the plover? So as the calidrous sandpipers probe for these aquatic invertebrates in the soft sand or substrate, they're acting like as beaters, kicking up fleas and brine flies that is preferred by the plucky plover there. Here's you'll often see a lot of birds exhibiting this screening behavior while they're resting. Of course, obviously they got to keep their feathers in really good shape, and they're just kind of out there resting. And while they're at it, they're doing a little bit of feather making. The dowitchers, you can see them doing that dowitching, that sewing motion of feeding, especially the two in the forefront there. Hence the name dowitcher. I think perhaps their evolutionary adaptations are no better illustrated than in nature than an amazing variety of bills on shorebirds, right? I mean, it's really cool. Each bill has evolved to complement this niche feeding technique. And that results in minimal competition with the heterospecific shorebirds. Shorebirds like the avocets and Wilson's phalaropes use these recurved bills to side the water, sweeping it back and forth, stir up and snag something, microscopic prey such as Daphnia. the avocet is so given to this type of eating that across millennia that it has become very specially adapted with that recurved bill. But this bottom feeding habit kind of comes with a bit of a cost. They're performed in, because if they do it in stagnant water, gives the avocet these chronic tapeworms. And the rankest flavor, so it is said, in its delectable tribe from one from South Carolina bird life. Oyster catchers have this ingenious bill. It's a triangular bill, bit of a cross between a knife and a chisel. They jab into this bivalve's gate, catching it napping if they can. Mollusk are not that hard to overtake, so oyster catcher is a bit of a stretch. But when they jab down there, it paralyzes its nervous system. Also from the South Carolina bird life, 1949. Sprunton Chamberlain says, occasionally an oyster catcher is undone by its own prey. For if a large oyster should clamp down on its bill, the bird may be held fast by its dour opponent until drowned by the tides. That's obviously an exaggeration, but they like to anthropomorphize and exaggerate a lot there in South Carolina, I think. Turnstones, as their name implies, they find the food by turning over seaweed and small stones. They're and most of the shorebirds are opportunistic at some level. So I mean, turnstones and plovers have been seen pirating other birds' eggs even, and getting a protein bump that way. They have other ways to detect or find prey. Snipe and woodcock are believed to be able to use their feet to sense underground prey. And many plovers, you'll see them foot tremble. Basically, it's a technique referred to as puddling. They usually do it in wet sand, and they'll lift one foot and vibrate the mud or the sand with their toes. And this is a photo of a piping plover doing that. It's a photo, so you don't really get to see the action, and it apparently can persuades the prey to show themselves to the birds, and maybe they think it's tidal action coming in, or that it's not really clearly known. And then phalaropes are spin above the water at the water, at a revolution about one revolution per second, creating these whirlpools, which then whips up the bottom dwelling insect larvae. And then they pick that off the surface with their needle-like beaks. So it's 7:47. How about we take an 8-minute break? Does that sound cool with y'all? Everybody
good.
there?
Oh, yeah.
And then what do we do?
And then we're gonna go and look at, we're gonna drill in. We're gonna drill in to Calidris sandpipers, which is probably why most of you took this class. Because that's the most difficult ones. And
Oh, boy.
So we're gonna go in to get into Calidris sandpipers.
Okay.
All
Now,
right.
Eddie, are you gonna delete last week's
The video, the recording,
yeah.
eventually. I
And
just
then,
put it,
but we can, it would be interesting to be able to watch the two together.
oh yeah, no, I'll leave them up for a while.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, no, I'm hoping you're enjoying it. Thanks, y'all. I'll be back in a little bit then. I'm back. Anybody here got any questions? Before we jump into this next part?
Yeah.
Had to go get a light. It's getting dark so early now.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So why are like egrets and herons not considered shorebirds?
Well, because they evolved into because of ancestry. They're in a whole nother order. They're not in the Shorebirds. So meaning their ancestors split off. And so they may have some convergent evolutionary behavior, but they're not, I mean, they're waders. And in fact, one thing that's really confusing is that in Europe, they call shorebirds waders. And in the Americas, we call waders egrets and such, And so it's, but anyway, they both wade and they both those orders have primarily aquatic lifestyles, but it's just happens to be convergent evolutionary traits that they both developed. Because for one thing, aquatic locations are high food sources for a lot of animals and especially birds. So they're both evolved to exploit mostly, aquatic ecologies, but their ancestry is very different. It goes way back to another, they split off quite a while ago from one another. Is that a good explanation?
Yeah, that was a great explanation. I was going to ask when you started saying that they were different species if the convergent evolution played into it. So yeah, that answered my question perfectly. Thank you.
Cool. I know it's unfortunately, with Zoom, I can't really see everybody all the time. So it's not quite the same as being able to make eye contact with you but it works pretty good. Like we were saying, it sure does cut down on travel time and setup and all that. So I'm going to go ahead and take off onto this next group. So the last time we went through the plovers and the lapwings and the family Shorebirdidae and the oyster catchers and avocets and stilts. And this time we're going to it's part one of the Scolopocidae, which is a very large family of widespread birds. The name Scolopocidae comes from scolops or scalopos, Greek which means pointed, as in a stick. Although lots of birds have that feature, but for whatever reason, they earn that one. Globally, there's 87 species and 21 genera. So it's not that many, but this is sort of the heart of what people refer to as sandpipers. And in North America, we've got 43 of those 87 species are regularly occurring in 16 of those genera. So since they're really widespread birds, that's not too surprising. California, 27 regularly occurring, plus many vagrants. So this is all of the genera. So Calidrius, Tringa, Numenius, curlews and whimbrels, for example, and Limosa, Godwits, Limnodromus or Dowitchers. Some of them are obvious, like Phalaropus or Phalaropes. Anyway, those are all the first part of their scientific name. And the reason that's kind of helpful to kind of like pay attention to is especially with some of these genera that have a lot of different members, particularly Calidris and Tringa, because the Tringa includes all of the various yellow leg type of birds, and willet and you know, solitary. Anyway, we're gonna go through that today. We're just gonna focus on 2 or 3 different of these genera. The Calidris sandpipers, which is the biggest group, and then we're going to also do, because of they're sort of in the same size area more than anything, as the Arenaria, the turnstones, and the Afrisa surfbirds, birds that we saw last weekend. So most of them in the Scolopocidae, they get kind of scant fossil records. I mean, birds don't fossilize well. So their relationship to these other shorebird families is not well resolved. You know, most of those relationships, they'll get better now that we've got genomics to work with. But but you know, going by fossil evidence, it's been tricky because these are small birds and there's just not a whole lot of fossils for them. So they're mostly aquatic, and all those different types of habitats that are listed there: tundra, water, you know, marshes, beaches, rivers. They can be very small to very large. In this group, I'm talking about the whole family right now, Scolopocidae. So, you know, we got the least sandpiper, which is the least of all the sandpipers, and we got the long-billed curlew, which is also the biggest shorebird of all. So we got both of them, the least and the biggest, and sometimes you can see them side by side. Most of them are monotypic, meaning they don't have too many subspecies. Because there's not been, you're typically not living in isolation in order to evolve those subspecies. And most of them have relatively long heads and bills too. Again, you know, you're showing some of that, this remarkable diversity with their bill. These are all birds that are in the Scolopocidae. Dunlin, spotted sandpiper, that's yellow legs, that's a red phalarope, that's a western sandpiper, that's a red knot, that's a ruddy turnstone, which is very similar to black turnstone. A Wilson snipe, that's a dowitcher, I think long-billed dowitcher. That's a curlew with kind of a short bill, that's a whimbrel, eating a little crab, and godwit. So these are all, you know, just a pretty big diversity within this family. Most of them are tactile feeders, meaning they're feeling, probing in the mud or sand. They've got these really highly developed Herpes corpuscles. Herpes corpuscle is a sensor that is in a lot of different animals, including mammals. And it's basically these sensors that kind of can feel pressure. So there's also do quite a bit of visual feeding, plucking or straining. There's some evidence that they can do tasting. That's a difficult thing to study in birds, because the morphology is very difficult to detect of taste buds and what it means to that bird's brain. So diet, primarily they're aquatic invertebrates. But some you'll see them eating crustaceans, fish, amphibians, like we're seeing seeds and fruit. There's also these biofilm, these dense layers of microbes I'll talk a little bit about before. This is some very high electron microscopic photos of tongues of the female western sandpiper. A is the lower bill, and B is the upper bill. So we're looking at mandibles here, not tongues, actually, mandibles. And also Dunlin over on the D, E, and F. So different kinds of bills, relatively thin and long for the Dunlin. It's also showing, oh, I'm sorry, the Lee sandpiper is the F right there. The scales is 1 millimeter. Skin has been removed and the bills were soaked in bleach to dissolve the remaining soft tissue, and it just exposed the pits to where the herpes corpuscles are found in these high densities in those sensory pits, in the pits of those. A little bit about their breeding. Most of them breed in the wet Arctic tundra habitat. They're primarily seasonally monogamous, meaning they'll pair bond during one season. And some are polygynous or polyandrous too. So in fact, the more that they study them, the more they see like extra pair copulations and stuff like that going on. Most of them are really territorial. Very few are colonial. Most of the nest usually just a scrape, simple scraped. Here's a spotted sandpiper nest I came upon when I was on the Feather River, and it was just a friend and I just hiking up a long way deep, very far from access. We were backpacking and we're just sitting down and having a snack, and all of a sudden the spotted sandpiper is like dashing around trying to get us to chase it, right? It seemed like it'd fly back and then it'd fly off and then fly back and fly off. And I suddenly kind of realized, oh, and I leaned over and there was this nest down in this in a shrub. So I took a quick snap and then we moved on. But anyway, that's, you can see the eggs are oval or pyriform shaped. They're usually 2 to 4 in this case. And the chicks, of course, are usually really cryptically colored naturally. Their chicks are precocial level too. So there's all these from altricial, you're naked, completely naked like humans and like songbirds, and need a lot of parental care, to all the way to these different levels of precocial, where some birds are even born and don't need any parental guidance. These sandpiper chicks are precocial level 2, which means they're mobile, they're born downy, not naked. They follow their parents, but their parents probably show them how to eat food, but they find their own food right off. Like most shorebirds, are primarily highly migratory, defend small feeding territories, pretty typical for shorebirds, and often really faithful to food productive wintering sites. And they know that from doing banding, where they'll see the same birds coming back to the same places. Some of them rarely form groups. They're really solo most of the time, and others are really flock gregarious. So And then now we're going to get into and look at some of them. Calidrine, or specifically calidrous sandpipers, include some of the most difficult to ID species, like what we've been talking about. They include calidrous and Afrisa. Afrisa, the only Afrisa that we've got is the surf bird. So anyway, these you can kind of see that these birds kind of like, mostly they just really look alike. You might notice that this bird is bigger, and it is a Dunlin, and these others are Western sandpipers. Although that one looks pretty small. It may be a least sandpiper, but I do think it's still just a in the angle, and it's a Western. Here's a size comparison of calidridine sandpipers. So when I say calidridine, these are all calidrous except for the surf bird, but the surf bird's closely related to these other birds. So it's in this greater, subfamily, if you will. And so you can see they're pretty uniform in size. You got the least sandpiper, which again is the least in size at 6 inches. And the biggest one is the red knot. That's the only one that that has more than 10 inches. Most of them, they're pretty uniform in size. Calidrous refers to speckled gray shorebird, named by Aristotle. Kind of funny to think about a word that goes all the way back, coined by Aristotle. The first one that we're going to look at, the first calidrous, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. Okay, maybe I will. Tylognimus. Try it on your own. It's Greek for feathered skin. Tylon is feathered. Cnimus, nimus, grieve or skin. So this is a rare bird. This is actually, if we saw one of these, it would be an eBird write-up. However, because mostly you can see there's a very small breeding range up in Alaska again, and they are very northerly wintering range. These are some pretty hardcore birds, right? However, occasionally one of them will, stray a little further south, and that's where this one is actually the celebrated rock sandpiper of Heron's Head Park. So it's the last 2 winters, our friends Ben Dudek and Teresa Ely went out there and found this bird, I guess 2019, and November of 2019, and it was like, wow, rock sandpiper in San Francisco. And then almost certainly the same bird came back again this past winter, and we'll see if it makes it again. But it's a pretty handsome looking bird. This is in its alternate or near full breeding plumage. And we've been, of course, trying to study it, Another April shot, you can see how dark it's gotten there. Here is the same bird, almost certainly the same bird in November of 2019. And here it is in November of 2020, same day, year later. And, I'll just say about this is that this bird, this may have a little bit more to do with lighting than it does the age of the bird, because this is almost got to be the same bird, but the lighting just was very different on these 2 different days. And also the background, you see it's behind the blue. So photography, it can be a little bit tricky. I mean, I'd like to say, oh, this is a juvenile bird in its hatch year, but I don't think so. I think it was an adult bird when it showed up here in November of 2019 or late October. And, you know, it just looks this different a year later. But here it is in April of 2020, right before it left, hopefully, and went all the way up to Alaska and had babies, and then came all the way back here again in the following fall. And it may do that again this year. It'll be on the bird reports if you get that. But anyway, kind of cool. We get some rare birds. I even got a little video of it. I didn't say it was good video, but I mean, you know, it's in focus at least, but it kind of looked kind of a little jerky on that one.
Not bad, not bad. Beautiful when it goes into that alternate plumage, though.
Yeah, isn't it? It's a gorgeous one, huh?
Definitely.
One that is super familiar to most people are sanderlings, because they gather in large numbers, usually on beaches, and they're an abundant bird for a little sandpiper. And so it's actually an Icelandic name. They say sand and erla for sand wagtail, and Calidris alba, which means white, the white sandpiper basically. And they can be in winter quite bright, but you get them in their alternate plumage and on the top left, and you can see how colorful they can really be. That's usually like about a 1 week period. You can get that in May, late April, early May, and boom, then they're gone. So mostly we see them in their basic or winter plumage, and that's really great. And they're really lovely to watch them fly and hang out on the and they have just beautiful, they're quite photogenic, I think, you know. I just love watching them going out there. They can use taste to determine, they've done some experimentation with these guys, and sanderlings are known to use taste to determine whether prey are present. So they can like taste the worm, taste whatever it is. So even though they're Herbst corpuscles, their touch sensors are more important than their chemoreception. But it was one of the first you know, determinations that they do use chemoreception for eating. And then the beautiful red knot. This is a red knot in pretty much full breeding plumage. Again, we don't often see them like that. But what a gorgeous bird, huh? Here's how we usually see them. and if we were to see them this weekend, it would likely be a juvenile. And you'll notice that scalloping right there. So kind of just a gray bird. This is sort of a lot of shadowing on there, but you can kind of see that scalloping there. And here's a bird that's in its full basic plumage. I can't tell adult or juvenile at that, because I think they molt into that, even whether they're adults or kids. But here's April. Here's a you know, this one's going into its breeding plumage. This one's pretty much full on. Just a really stunner of a bird. There's 6 subspecies. Ours is this Rosalari, which is the same subspecies that you'll get over in the Gulf of Mexico and along the Florida. There's this other one that is a very long distance migrant, and they can migrate up to 600 miles per day. Pretty cool for a little bird like that. There was a bunch of them mixed in this flock. You can see one right there. They're bigger. They're, you know, they're 10.5 inches, so quite a bit more. So they stage up here in late summer, but most of them winter in the Sea of Cortez. So now is a good time to see them. A bird that I know this is a bird that gets reported. It's semi-palmated sandpiper. And there's one that's been getting seen where we're going this weekend. So we'll be looking for it. Look at the stubbiness of the bill. It's got dark legs like a Western sandpiper, but it's got this stubby bill, and it's kind of got this not very colorful kind of dark mantle, but it's got the white throat, like as we'll see in Western sandpipers. But if you look, California is not in their migrant range, but yeah, we get a few of them every year. So this is a bird that people are very pleased to see here in winter, and they'll usually just be here a little bit until they move on, because they're long distance migrants. You can see they spend a lot of their time in the Caribbean and along the coast of South America. Here's the same bird, the juvenile there, but if you're in Florida, you might see an adult, or Texas, or along the Gulf Coast. But see how stubby that bill is? Kind of like a leaf sandpiper, but a little thicker at the base. And again, the white throat is kind of a good giveaway, as opposed to the Western sandpiper. Now, and we've already talked a little bit about that, the breeding range, the winter range. We're very likely to see this bird. This is its breeding plumage, but we're not going to see it like that. Probably we're going to see it more like this in its worn adult or juvenile. So here it is in April, but by the time it's flown all the way north and then come back down here, it's pretty worn out, and after this it'll go into its it'll start molting, and then this will be what it looks like by December. So adult, here's a kid. The bill on this one looks a little bit longer. I think that is, that's one of the tips for thinking it might be a kid compared to this somewhat stubbier bill. Again, the white throat is something I'll be looking for on these birds. Not so noticeable here, quite noticeable on the July, and kind of just a white along there. But see how fresh this plumage is on the kid compared to that. This one did look like that. Now it's worn down to that. We kind of looked at this already about how they're staging. A little look at the Cheyenne bottoms there, if you're ever there in late summer, good space to stop. And I wanted to just, I know we don't have a whole lot of time here, but I wanted to talk about their diet a little bit, which is a lot of times they'll be feeding. You saw those birds kind of stitching their, sticking their bill in there, and they've got this, they're able to get this biofilm, which has this dense layer of these microbes, and in this like kind of gelatinous, or they call it mucilaginous matrix, and it's secreted by these benthic bacteria, and it's really delicious, I hear. So but anyway, this is sort of more sciencey than you probably want to know. But anyway, it's pretty interesting that that they really go for this this biofilm rather than insects, and this is how they can do it. Here's these keratinous spines on the edges and the tips of the tongues. They stick that in this biofilm, and it sticks to it, right? So, and then you know, they're just slurping it on back and catching it, using it like a net. Kind of cool, huh? And here's our commonly sandpiper. You know, this is probably one of the more familiar calidrous sandpipers to us. The Munitilla, diminutive, very small. And it's got a very wide range. It's, you know, it's a common bird. Look how wide the breeding range is. So they've got a pretty high ecological tolerance. And again, we looked at some of this comparative earlier last week, but notice in all of these, the legs are what? They're yellowish. But the problem is you can, if they're down in mud or if there's a high shadow, it is sometimes very difficult to see that yellow leg, believe it or not. And so it looks kind of shadowy a lot of times. Here we go. We're here in August. So we're gonna probably see either juveniles like this. You'll see this kind of part right here. People referred to that as a bib. And in the adults, it's in its spiffy, not very old plumage. The adult is in its a worn plumage here. And by winter time, it's going to molt into this. But right now, we're going to see the adults in worn plumage, and we're going to see the kids in a fresher, more red, like but yellow legs, and they've got this bib, and look at that tiny bill compared to Western, longer bill, shorter bill, tinier. Here's some side by side, two Westerns and the least. These least sandpipers use this surface tension. You know, when you press down, you'll see water striders and stuff. They can just ride that water. There's a surface tension. And also when they can use this tension to transport prey from the bill tip to the mouth. They eat a lot of this, like these amphipods, like Carophium, which is abundant in that type of water. Microscopic, we don't see it, but if you get a field scope out and put some water on that. And then Dunlin, we talked about them. Another more pretty widespread breeder up in the Arctic, and a broad front migrant. I don't have any photos I see from August or September because, again, they don't usually show up here until later. They're a bigger bird. They've got longer bills. They have a brownish bib in winter. But by May, like they're getting all gussied up, and they get these dark bellies right before they go back up north again. You can examine tail patterns, looking in your field guide, that can be helpful. Again, there's a Dunlin mixed in with a lot of Western sandpipers, so very similar, slightly bigger. If you could see the side, you would be able to see that it has bib like that. But not likely we're going to see those this weekend. Bared sandpipers. Possible this would be another. Notice those primaries. This is a very long distant migrant. So it migrates all the way down into Peru and down to Tierra del Fuego. In fact, this photo is from Peru. Got to go there in 2016, my last international trip. And was pleased to see Barrett's sandpipers down there. But also, you know, they're not totally uncommon in migration, a little bit less so here in California, but we get them every year, and we'll keep, one of the big clues is that those long primaries. So if we see a bird that looks a little bit different than the others, one of the first things I check is the primaries. Same thing with their white rump, also very long primaries, also a broad, but this is even a more rare bird here. But you know, that's what we'd be trying to figure out if we saw a bird with super long primaries in that shape. Is it that, or is it this, or is it this? Are we looking at something like that? Are we looking at something like this? Notice the streaking heavily in May, but even in winter time. Kind of a cool looking bird anyway. I've never seen one in California, but I've seen Bairds. Here's another example. Look how dark their back is compared to this. And also the white rump in flight. There's the white rump. The Bairds has got a dark rump. Of course, you got to make it fly to see that. Pectoral, also another bird we don't get too often here, but every year we get some of them. Usually September. Bigger, orange bill, those bright yellow legs, they should be pretty obvious if we see it. Stilt sandpiper, that's a breeding range. Another bird we don't see here much. These are unusual, but you see this, we get them almost every winter down at the Salton Sea. It's not shown on this map, but they look more like this one right there, very plain gray, and they tend, because they have long legs, they tend to hang out in deeper water. Buff-breasted sandpipers. I know I'm going over just a little bit, but we're almost through this. Another rarity, this bird, one of these hung out at Heron's Head for a few weeks back about 12 years ago. So, you know, you never know. These birds can show up. These are photos. We get them, usually often get them in Texas when we're there in April. And they can do these fantastic, very cool displays. The males do trying to hook up with females. And then there's these other calidrids that are really rare and people are, you know, get them. All of these have been seen in California. Very difficult to identify. We're not going to take the time, obviously, right now to try and get into these rarities. But it's something that takes quite a lot of study. It's just usually when somebody notices, hey, that one's a little bit different. What's up with that? But one that is quite a bit different that we do get more often or occasionally is the ruff. We usually get them. This is a photo that I took. The rest of these are not. They're other people's photos. They're primarily Eurasian and African, and they come in these different styles. The males have these are all male ruffs. Look how bizarrely different they are. They're almost like fancy chickens. And that's it for the calidris. We're just going to take a look at one more bird here that we actually saw this last weekend, which is a surf bird. And they're, you know, as we mentioned, they're rocky birds. Oh, I'm sorry, I lied. We're going to talk about the Arenaria too. The surf birds, but they hang out with who? They hang out with turnstones. Ruddy, which is becoming rare in the West, and black. Ruddies used to be fairly common winter birds here, and we may very well see them this Sunday, but their numbers have dropped a lot. This is how they look in the spring. This is how we might see them. Not that fancy plumage, but still pretty cool looking. And then black turnstones, which we did get distant looks at. Quite an obvious bird. Here's a breeding look. You can see that little white mark on them, but here's a winter look. Anyway, can kind of see the blacks only breed in Alaska and winter all the way down the coast of Baja. And the reddies do some Alaska, but mostly up in the Arctic islands and have a much more dispersed winter habitat. And that's it. Y'all still awake?
Very weak.
Cool. Well, I hope you like that. I'll be sending out directions, specific directions to the site, but many of you may have been there already, Hayward Regional Shoreline. And I know a lot of people here are East Bay, so that'll be easier for you. And really looking forward to that trip. Any
Okay.
questions before we call it a night?
Did you say anything about scopes? I got on a little late and I didn't know whether you had talked a little bit about scopes.
I haven't, but what I will do is send out soon. I'm sorry, I got busy this week and I didn't. I started a little resource guide that I'm going to share with you all. It may take me a few more days. Sorry, because things have gotten kind of other things got in the way, restoration work and stuff like that. I do a lot of work with the California Native Plant Society, and things are very active right now. So I try and ignore it for a while, and then I keep getting emails that eventually I have to respond to. But really good seeing you all. Thanks so much for being here again.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot, Eddie.
I hope most of you can
Next
make it
Sunday.
to the trip.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
bye-bye.
you. And it's gonna be from like 12 to 3. Is that
Yes,
right?
12 to 3, or as
Okay.
long as you can take it, but we'll meet at 12 and we'll walk out. It's about a mile walk out.
Okay.
All
Great.
right. Take
Thank
care.
you.